See, as a gatekeeper, Jay Watson was being true to his nature, true to who he is, not only in his role, but also true to his soul, right? God is so faithful. You know, my heart is just bursting because God continues to reveal why he brought my father, Ernest McEwen Jr., and William Faulkner together, and why he allowed me to be the one person in my family to be the writer and the carrier, the steward of this story. Now, that's not to say that other people in my family don't share this story, but I'm the one who writes about it, right? And I'm the one who speaks about it time after time after time again, because I believe that's something that I can pass on, and it's actually that it's my responsibility to pass on as part of my father's and part of William Faulkner's intertwined legacy. Now, when I spoke at the conference, the theme for that year, they have a different theme every year, but the theme for that year was called Faulkner and Money. And I called my presentation Legacy, the Currency of Eternity. Now, everything I know about legacy I learned from my father, my mother, my extended family, Faulkner, and God. Early on, I learned that our current notions about legacy are totally outmoded. They are too constrained, too barren to embrace the magnificence, the marvelousness of the human spirit. Here's what I know. Contrary to conventional Western ways of knowing, legacy is not something that happens out there, nor is it something that happens at the end of our life after we accumulate financial assets to bequeath to others. Legacy's focus is actually spiritual, and it is concerned not with our outer life, but with our inner life, what I call the inner music of who we are, what we say, and what we do. Legacy is concerned with the harmony of all of those aspects of ourselves. And you know what? Ultimately, legacy is a calling. It's a summons to stewardship, a summons that calls us to be faithful servants, that calls us to make a covenant with the future by making a positive difference today. And for us here today, as sisters and brothers, as daughters and sons, we make that same covenant right here in this church and in our families and in our communities. How can that be, you might ask? Well, it's pretty simple. How we live is how we serve. In fact, how we live is how we do everything. Each of us creates a legacy, whether we are aware of it or not. The greatest gift we can give to God and to others is to be intentional about the legacy we live, because it's all about the choices we make every single day, 365, 24/7. What you choose is all about your faithfulness to who you are and to whose you are. Can I get an amen? Now, at the end of the day, legacy is about every decision you make, every phone call you take, every text message you send, every Instagram, who and what you decide to include or to ignore. Legacy is also an invitation to be faithful to who you are and to what you value. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the faithfulness and the intertwined legacies of my dad and William Faulkner. Just like me, my father was born in Oxford, Mississippi. He was born 88 years ago. Now, back then, Oxford was very different than it is today. When my father was a young boy, 4 or 5 years old, this was back in the 1930s, So when he was 4 or 5 years old, he had two dreams. My father wanted to live in a house with running water, and his second dream, more than anything, he wanted to go to college. Now, my father was the kind of person who would tell anybody about his dreams. It didn't matter what you looked like, didn't matter where you came from, didn't matter if you were young or old, he would talk to you about his dreams. And if you can imagine this young boy growing into young manhood, at 21, my father is still talking about those two dreams, living in a house with running water and wanting to go to college. Now, at this particular time, he was actually working at a college. He was working at the University of Mississippi, mopping floors, sweeping floors, cleaning toilets. He was a janitor at Ole Miss. He was also married to my mom, and he had my two older sisters and me, okay, 3 little girls. And you know what? My father was still talking about his dreams to the students, to the professors, to anyone who would listen. And you know that little game of telephone tag where you tell somebody and then they tell somebody else and they tell somebody else? Well, one of those somebodies was a person at Ole Miss who put my father one step closer to his dreams. And that person was named Dr. Love. Now, Dr. Love was a dean at Ole Miss, and he had heard about my father through somebody else, and when he met my father, he said, "Young man, tell me about your story. Tell me about your dreams." And my father did. And he said, "You know, Mr. McEwen, I want to introduce you to somebody who can help you fulfill your dreams." Now, let me tell you something. Back in those days, this would be the early 1950s, to be called Mr. McEwen was a very special thing. It was a significant salutation, a significant greeting. That meant that Dr. Love was showing my father ultimate respect. You weren't called Mr. anything as a black man back in those days, okay? Not in the Deep South. So, Dr. Love fell in love with my dad, right? You can't make this up. And he put my father in touch with a gentleman who would change his life and my family's life for all time, would actually change the whole trajectory of the McEwen family. And he introduced my dad to William Faulkner. Now today, when you're introduced to somebody, you get an email introduction, right? Or maybe you get a text message. But back in those days, you had a real introduction. And, you know, even if my father had had a phone, which he didn't, he wouldn't have called Mr. Faulkner. He would have paid him a visit. He would have walked right up to his house, and that's what he did. He walked up to Roanoke, where Faulkner lived, and Mr. Faulkner said, "Young man, I have been waiting for you. Tell me about your dreams." And my father did. And Faulkner said, "Well, Mr. McEwen, where do you want to go to college? Where do you want to go to school?" And my father said, without missing a beat, he said, "Alcorn, A&M. Oh, that's a mighty fine college, a mighty fine school for blacks. You'll get a solid education there." Young man, I would like to pay for your tuition. I want to pay for your room and board. I want to buy your books. I want to make sure that you and your wife, Millie, have clothes to wear, and that your young girls do too. Now, what do you think my father said? He said, "Oh, no, sir. I can't accept your generosity. I don't know how I'd ever be able to pay you back." And Faulkner just looked at my father with a little twinkle in his eye. He said, "Oh, Mr. McEwen," he said, "I don't expect you to pay me back. You just pass this blessing on to somebody else when you're able to do that." And you know what? My father enrolled at Alcorn A&M College that fall with my mom and me and my 2 older sisters right by his side. My mom and dad were grateful for the blessing of being together as a family and for Faulkner's windfall blessing of just absolute generosity. Now, let me tell you this. Whether Faulkner had asked my father to pass it on or not, he would have done just that because that's who he was. And when he was able to do so, my father was faithful in encouraging and supporting many, many family members, friends, and coworkers to pursue their education. In fact, if my dad was alive today, he'd be right out there with you, right next to you. And he would be all in your face, encouraging you to get your GED, or if you had your GED, he'd encourage you to get your community college degree, your graduate degree, whatever degree you didn't have. That was my father. Passionate, tireless, unshakable in his faithfulness to who he was. How wonderful to witness and now to amplify the legacy created by my father's vision and by his and Faulkner's faithfulness to who they were and what they stood for as human beings. Their uncommon respect for the birthright dignity of every human being has created a legacy that continues to resound within our family and throughout the world, creating a ripple effect that continues to flow and flow and flow and just keep on flowing out into the world. When we are faithful to ourselves, it helps us to be faithful to other people. It becomes easier for us to put a face on a hungry child, to put a face on the woman or the man who is homeless, a face on the young man or the young woman or the child who has hair and lips and cheeks that look different than our own. When faithfulness becomes our standard way of being, our standard MO, our standard way of moving in the world, we won't have to wonder about how to have that fierce or courageous conversation, right? Or how to build community, because we will be in community. When we are faithful, we create a ripple effect of faithfulness, and we never know how that ripple will expand, where it will flow, or how many lives it will touch. And you know what? It's not our business to know. Our business is to be faithful. To be faithful, and our business is to make ourselves useful, to be of service to others, to pass our blessings on. In my family, in my personal village, this is a given. I know that's also true for some of you out there, for many of you out there. In fact, when I was a little girl, my mother would often say to me, make yourself useful. Irritating, right, when you're a little kid. But today, those words, make yourself useful, are words of legacy. They are words of faithfulness. Again, I'm blessed and honored to be able to share with you today and to give you a glimpse into my story, my father's story, and my family's story. I want to close today with a poem called Song to Myself. And this is closing the message on faithfulness. It's a poem that amplifies what I've shared today about courage, gratitude, vision, and legacy. It's a celebration and tribute to two ordinary men who had the extraordinary resolve to move against the tide, of the times, to be faithful to themselves and to God, to be faithful at a turbulent time in our history, kind of like the times we're living in today, if you think about it. A time when it was not in fashion for whites to extend a hand to blacks, and almost unthinkable for a black man to imagine a life other than the one he was born into. This is a poem also about faithfulness. It's one of my own poems, and it's called Song to Myself. Song to Myself. It doesn't matter to me